Good morning. We want to take the opportunity to take you through the Gaia-X Framework, and it's actually more an update where we are today. We will talk a little bit about the business framework first, and then Pierre will take you down to the engine room and show you a little bit more in detail how it works. So let me start a little bit more in general. Okay.
Can you use the handheld because we can
Okay. A little bit more in general where we stand. So we have a lot of lighthouse projects, and I wanted to show this because this is really where market adoption happens. We can do a lot of stuff in theory. We can bring up technology. We can bring up policies and rules. We can invent labels, but if it's not happening in the market, nothing happens really. And when you look at this last year when we were at Market X, I think we had 8 lighthouse projects. And now this is our current list of lighthouse projects, and you see there is also a distinction. We have lighthouse data spaces. The difference between a lighthouse project and the lighthouse data space is that the lighthouse data space is really up and running from a business perspective. So they use an accredited Gaia-X clearinghouse. They have data space services up and running, and they're using them on an industry scale. To take Catena as an example, because it started in Germany, their clearinghouse is T-Systems, and we will in the next session have Sven here from T-Systems talking about the opportunity on the clearinghouse. So it's really where the use case meets of the users meets the use case of the providers. So that is, I think, a very strong message. Secondly, as Alessandra already said, we don't do it alone. We have a lot of hubs. We have hubs in Europe. We have international hubs, and those international hubs are getting more and more important because of initiatives like International Manufacturing X, which are clearly moving global with global value chains. So we're talking about Japan. We're talking about the US as very strong players, and we are working with a lot of other countries. I saw Martina this morning. We were, for 2 weeks ago on Friday, we were in Bratislava together with Hungary and Czech and representatives and Austria and representatives of the ministries to get this region kick-started. And I think that was a very good starting point to be stronger in the CE region. So who is Gaia-X? I think it's really important to understand that we are probably the largest organization in terms of industry mandate. We have a lot of members, and we have members from very large organizations down to associations and public sector. And this is really where we get the mandate for what we do. Everything that is done in the committees, everything that is done in the working groups, everything is done in the development teams and the OSS communities are actually always under the governance of the industry that is supposed to use it. So that's where the lighthouse projects basically come together with the membership. Now let's talk about data spaces. Data space as a balancing instrument. When you try to do data spaces, it's all about data sharing or data usage of data that's probably not your own. And it gives you a lot of conflicts. There is a conflict between community and individual. There's conflicts between being innovative and being regulated. There is conflicts between data sharing and data protection. And also governance. There can be a central governance, and that's what Ulrich showed in the early stages of data sharing. But there is also decentralized governance. This is what we have today in data spaces. And this is a balance that you need to figure out, and that's also a key driver, for example, for AI applications, because AI has 2 major issues. Number one is you need to get good data, and most likely you need to get data that you don't own. And secondly, you need to have the chance to, be fully traceable. So you need to understand where the data was coming from. And when you think about training or fair training of algorithms, it's really important that you understand where the data is coming from, and that you can trust the data that was the training source of your algorithms. Now, when we talk about data spaces, we can simplify this, and we can say We have a business layer, a data space stack, and we have standardization bodies. Why that? When you look at the early data spaces we had, the early data spaces were always end-to-end. So they were building the business model, they were building the infrastructure, everything was done from scratch. But when you look at it, and I take the example of Booking.com, always what they do is they basically connect the user with various systems. So they don't have planes, they don't have trains, although that wouldn't be very useful at this moment in time with all the strikes. Then they don't have hotels, but what they do is they give you the right experience and bring everything together. So a business idea not necessarily needs all the infrastructure underneath, but that only works under certain, when you have certain prerequisites and under certain circumstances. And that is what we are trying to do with interoperability. And it's a mixture of a trust framework and the right semantics and the right architecture. So the business layer really has the business case in mind. The data space stack has, of course, some infrastructure and the capabilities or building blocks, as they are called in the DSSC, and then we have standardization down there. Okay, so when you try to connect two data spaces, and that is really also, Ulrich mentioned it briefly, it is pretty simple if you have a clear use case and you negotiate with your business partners what kind of data you share, how you're going to share the data, and you can trust each other. But what if you want to connect to someone with an unforeseen business case? So something that was coming up quickly, and that's what we see every day in our very fast digital world. And you take something that is maybe very traditional, take the automotive industry. Catena-X was in the automotive industry, and the original starting point of Catena-X was basically that the OEMs connected to their tier 1, 2, and 3 providers to make sure they understand their value chains and they understand their supply chains. But with the European Commission pushing heavily for electric vehicles, all of a sudden data spaces in the area of energy and grid become more and more important, because at some point your car will be part of a distributed or federated grid system. And so with that, the next step would logically be that you need to understand that you're going into the smart city areas. And then you need really a joint trust system and a joint architecture to be fast in connecting to those new data spaces. And they are in 4 layers. This is policy. So if data space A and data space B don't agree to do anything together, it's completely useless. Underneath that, you have procedures and rules, and then you have semantics, and on the very bottom, you have the technology layer to exchange data. What does that mean in practice? Well, in practice, that means that, for example, if the automotive industry, and that's actually a real example, wants to share data with aerospace, they have a new idea, a new business case. That's what we see in the middle, this new business layer. You agree on some governance, and then those little bubbles, let's look at them like nodes of data. And you can connect data nodes and share completely the data that are in those nodes. You can selectively share data between those nodes, and you can decide not to share certain nodes at all. But what you don't do is you're not building an infrastructure again. So you're basically building a virtual stack, and that makes you very fast, and it's way cheaper than what we did in the past when we built up the entire systems. Another good example, and I'm sure that Pierre will talk about that in more detail, is if you want to, in this case, I took the example of manufacturing and energy, if you want to share catalog items. So once you have data products or services, you can put them in a Gaia-X catalog, and those catalogs can be shared with each other through the credential event service. And that is a very powerful tool, because you can start going outside, proactively outside of your own data space and move into new data spaces. And now in the second part of the presentation, I want to talk a little bit about the heart of this whole thing, which is the digital clearinghouse. On a business overview, we have a deep dive with the providers after that session.
Your first contact with Gaia-X is with one of the many Gaia-X digital clearinghouses. The clearinghouses form the heart of the ecosystem, implementing the rules and principles of Gaia-X. They validate that participants and services are compliant within Gaia-X and guarantee that everyone complies with the rules. They operate in a variety of locations and link the services that maintain participants' trust in data exchange. Clearinghouses are interconnected and constantly synchronized. Before a participant can exist in Gaia-X, it must present its information in a pre-established format. The clearinghouse then checks that the description of the company and its services comply with the operating rules and issues an admission certificate for a specified period. At the end of this period, the process must be re-accepted by a clearinghouse in order to continue operating in the Gaia-X environment.
Okay, many thanks again, because this video has been produced by the French Hub, and honestly, I never managed myself to explain it that clear in 90 seconds. Let's go a little bit deeper anyway. There is a few components that are inside the digital clearinghouse. You have the registry, the compliance service, the notary service. These three are mandatory. And then you have three more which are optional, which is the wizard, the catalog, a catalog, there can be multiple catalogs, and the credential event service. And we showed that in Alicante already, the credential event service, we had, I think, Pierre, was 8 catalogs. 8 catalogs are connected from different data spaces, different projects are connected through that service. The credential event service will become a mandatory component in the next release in Loire. And now let's talk about the other concept within the clearinghouse, and that is conformity and the labels. You see here there is C for conformity, then there's level 1, 2, and 3. And they are getting more and more sovereign, there's more and more rules behind and more trust behind those. And we can start with the declaration of service of products that is done for every layer. We're doing we sign them with a verified method. This could be EIDAS, but it could be also other methods that we have already implemented, because EIDAS doesn't work for everyone and it doesn't work outside Europe. We have automated validation by the clearinghouse. That means we have 59 criteria in conformity that you need to fulfill and you can declare. But we have also technical possibilities to check those declarations if they are true. Not all of them, but some of them. And that is automated verification and validation. So first we do validation for all services, and then we do verification for some of those services. Why is that important? Automated verification on conformity in level 1, because it's cheap. When you think about level 2 and level 3, when you need an external cap, let's say PwC or TÜV or whoever is really auditing your processes, that is a pretty big process, and it's lengthy and it's expensive. Level 1 has a way lower entry barrier as well as conformity. And I come to the 2 pluses a little bit later. Then we have data exchange policies. These are rules how data can be exchanged and rules that you can enforce on exchanging data with any partner. Then we have a certified label logo, which is also, I think, an important marketing tool that you can basically rubber stamp that you do have a Gaia-X label. And that's not just some fancy logo, because it's only possible if you run your service first through the clearinghouse, and that acts as a label issuer, and you actually get a valid label. So the logo alone wouldn't help you, because you need to be in a catalog, and there need to be a digital rubber stamp too for the labels. Then, when enforcing data protection by EU legislation, we intentionally left that out on conformity, but as you know, if you provide a service in Europe or to Europe, then you have to also already follow the rules. There is no difference, but this is done so that, for example, Japan can do that without following GDPR if they're not exchanging data directly with the European users. Then we have manual verification by CEB. That's the audit process that I mentioned earlier. And let me go back to the pluses now. What we do with automated verification by the clearinghouse is that if you have, let's say, an ISO 27000 certificate, what the system does is it checks that that standard is permissible for a specific criteria we have, and that the auditor that you used is actually a valid accredited CAP for that standard, and that it's properly signed. So then again, it's a fully automated process once you have the right certificate in place. And finally, on label 3, the provider headquarter has to be in the European Union. And I think that is a very important overview what the thinking of the Policy and Rules Committee was, and how we're going to get from very simple but still valid trust systems up all the way to level 3 certifications, and conformity in level 1 can be done only with clearinghouses with no additional involvement of CAPs and manual verification. And I think that is an important message for the smaller enterprises. So where are we with clearinghouses? We will come to that in the next session in more detail. We have for non-commercial use, the Gaia-X Lab. We have Aruba, they're here today. We have T-Systems, and we have AIA Networks from Spain. And we will very soon have Orange and OVH. We had some very important meetings last week in Paris. And I also think Proximus is very close to become a clearinghouse. So you can see they are growing, and it's easier and easier to get your services validated. And finally, real quick, a look at the strategic roadmap. Apart from the marketing events that we have on top, we have introduced a couple of programs like Powered By program, endorsement program, promoting the clearinghouses. And below you see the releases, and we are working on the documentation of 2403, so that's the next release of the policies and rules for Loire. And Pierre's team is already working on the next release of code in Loire together with the OSS community, and that will be available by the summit as usual in November. And with that, I hand it over to you, Pierre.
Thank you very much. The slides that are going to be presented are a bit more technical, but not as technical as the current presentation happening right now in the tech theater. So if there is anyone who would like to see less PowerPoint and more source code, please join them. Let's take the opportunity to have a smaller crowd than expected due to the strikes to give you the opportunity to directly talk to the people who actually are making the code available. They are in the tech theater room there. With that, then, let's jump to the presentation. We have different ecosystems, A and B, and they want to talk. Ecosystem, data spaces, federation, same name for something. The 4 layers that you have right now, those are coming from the European Interoperability Framework. So legal, is it even legal to use the services to share my data? Then organizational, semantic, and technical. And there is some confusion about am I on which layer. So Gaia-X, we focus on the one in the middle. It doesn't mean that we don't address the other one, particularly the technical one, but we focus on the one that are in bold blue. And now I have a question. Who can spot the difference between the certificate from the left and the certificate from the right? It's difficult and you will not get the answer. I know, that's a trick. But the one in the right, left, on that side. If I'm using it, I'm signing like a legal binding document. So that's a certificate extract from my public key certificate that enables me to sign document and have a legal power on that, a legally binding value. The one on the other side, right? You get it. That's a certificate that I'm generating locally. It has little legal value, no value at all. And that's the difference you will get between a technical compatibility and organizational and semantic compatibility, meaning that you can use software that's usable. That's maybe the slides I will spend most of the time on. Sorry for looking at numbers. But you can have software that are going to talk the same API being able to use credential, being able to use, for example, here, those are RSA keys. But the semantic, the value of those keys are totally different. And you are not going to trust them if you don't know where are those certificates coming from. That's why, for example, IDSA and other associations, we work on this organizational and semantic interoperability. So IDSA, Data Space Protocol, the contract negotiation. That's a translation of what we have in the law. For example, in the law, the differences between a smart contract that you will find in blockchain and a smart legal contract is the fact that to be legal, a contract should always have a termination clause. This is not something that you can just implement automatically. You need to have an information model for that. And you need to agree on the fact that when you reach that point, terminated, that's the end of the execution. To be implemented in Solidity, in another Ethereum machine language, in Python, in Node.js or whatnot, that's the technical layer. To agree on what it means, that's the layer above. And on the, I'm going to stop doing that, on that side, you have the Gaia-X registry. The Gaia-X registry, that's the place where you get the information about the schema. What is a country code? Country code, do we say Allemagne for French, in French, Germany in English, Deutschland in German? So we need to agree on the language. Here we decided to use, for example, ISO 3166 format, which is those two-letter country code. Regulation, when you talk about, we saw in the short presentation, participant needs to be identified. What do we use for identification? Legal business registration number. Okay, fine, but in some country you have an area, subdivisions. So you have specific numbers per subdivision within the country. We need to agree on the format. That's the schema. The shape, that's the rules. So for the shape, we have a technical way to implement that using source code. And that's where you will get the rules of what does it take to provide a service. A service, you need to have a provided by. When you have consent, when you have data information, and you have information about a personal human person, you need to have the consent being able for the data provider to be able to demonstrate the proof of the consent. The trust anchor, again, back to the definition of the certificate. Who are the legit entity to issue a certificate? Roland mentioned it in the compliance and the labels levels. If you have an ISO certification, who is eligible to issue that type of certification? That's what we meant by trust anchor. All of those information are stored inside the Gaia-X registry. That's a functional description of the element. Technically speaking, that could be decentralized. We are working with peer-to-peer networks, IPFS, but that's a detail. And if you want to know more, take theater. Why we do that? Because we want to enable trust. There is a bit more, too much text on that slide, but maybe the first line is important. What is trust? Trust is not something I can give you. That's something that you will have to decide. I can show you my credential, and then you will trust me. But I cannot force someone to trust. Otherwise, this is not a contract by the definition of what we have in civil law in Europe, where you force someone to enter into a contractual relationship. Again, everything that we are doing that has implication with the law. So it's not like we are implementing the law, but we are way beyond just technical specification. So in trust, usually you have two parties that are going to exchange and negotiate on something. Am I able to do something, or is he able to fulfill, to give me something back? So this relation of decision-making party and targeted party, that's a very simple case with two parties. But imagine that you have a chain of them. So the target party later becomes the decision party with another targeted party. And you are able to chain them one with another. And why do we need that? Because we have policy negotiation. We talk about the identity, again, very important part. But you have different type of policy negotiation. Business to business, that's the one when we enter contract relation with companies. But within the company, employer-employee, when you delegate rights, when the CEO delegates rights to the CFO to the legal department to the engineers, and then the engineers to the machine, to the service. When you configure your machine, SSH key, add something, you delegate rights, you delegate part of your rights to that machine. And how do you build that? Through trust, the fact that you will not share the key with someone else, the fact that you can have a key revocation, the fact that you can maybe do key rotation also, and so on. So this chain of very high level, business to business, employer, employee, customer, business, natural person to the process, process to process, for machine to machine, that you need to be able to anchor to the hardware. We had a talk just recently before this morning, so I'm adding that now on the slides. But the process, that's the running service, that's the instance live running in the memory, that runs somewhere. I mean, we can talk about serverless or cloud, but the cloud is just the computer of someone else. So it has some hardware. Policy negotiation, we have that everywhere. Consent management, am I granting you the right to process my data for that specific purpose? When we entered the building, we had to show some credential. We were expected to be on the list, and we have a nice badge. That's a type of credential. You have that everywhere. And that you need that to have really the data transaction and trust the data transaction, for you to trust the data transaction. And this trust, it's not just one way. So here is the small scenario that we have, that we come up with. That's the condensation summary of the scenario that we ran in Alicante last year. As a user, you want to trust the service provider that they are not going to leak your data out, or that the data is going to be located within specific regional area. So that's from the consumer to the provider. But the provider is the same thing. Who is this consumer consuming my data? Is he going to use my VM and bare metal to mine some bitcoins or some crypto assets? Is he going to use that for illegal purposes? So this trust is bidirectional. The good thing is that the entire first part of that slide, that's done and live. So it's not like I'm presenting you what will be done, but I'm presenting something that is up and running. With that, we have now if we deep dive, and that's the most complex slides that we have, how it works. So we have a conformity scheme, the 4 levels that were presented before. And for those conformity schemes, depending on which criteria needs to be fulfilled, you will have to either sign claim or gather claim using third-party impartial CAB. By the way, everything that you see with a small little star here, declaration, certification, party, everything which is there, that's come from the ISO specification. So it's not invented, meaning that you give someone a slide or those schema to someone else from your compliance department internally, they should be able to understand. And again, this is way more than just technical implementation. Technically speaking, all the boxes with the small badges, those are verifiable credentials, but they carry a different semantic again. So this is very important. And that will be my conclusion for today. In Gaia-X, you have basically 2 big pillars. The technical part, we use a lot of specification from the W3C, DIT document, ETSI, X509. That's the plumbing. Important one, without that it doesn't work. But you can find some of that somewhere else. And this is the part that will go inside the Eclipse Trust Protocol that was mentioned earlier. And then you have a second big pillar, which is way bigger and where we focus on. That's the creation of those conformity scheme. So with the 4 levels, and the rules that makes you able to take a decision whether or not you trust your partners and the next person. Thank you very much. And we are staying at your disposal for any question. Don't hesitate, we are going to have the tech theater.